going. Got to tell you as well, if you're heading out, the traffic lights as you come off of Independence Square South, turning right to get onto Rising Road, those traffic lights have been out since yesterday, and you can well imagine the kind of traffic situation that would result from that, especially during the peak traffic hours. All right, let's get back into In the Morning. I've got a book sitting on my lap here, and that book is written by Gaylord Kelshall, a name that is familiar and synonymous with the Military History Museum in Chaguaramas. He served for some 12 years in our Coast Guard here in Trinidad and Tobago, and of course he's also a pilot. So it's with great pleasure, Kizzy, that we welcome him to NCC Channel 4. Gaylord Kelshall, nice to have you in with us, especially as we talk about this book, The Gateway to South America, Trinidad and the South American Revolution. Good morning to you.
Good morning, and thank you very much.
Right. I've actually started with the back of the book, but as I turn to that, tell me what prompted you to do this work?
The need to rewrite virtually the entire history of Trinidad. Because what we have done is to try and link Trinidad with the rest of the Caribbean. And Trinidad never was, never will be, a sugar island. Right? Trinidad has a totally different history that has simply been totally ignored. Trinidad was Spanish for 300 years. There isn't a thing in the school books about 300 years of Spanish rule. Right? With some very, very important events taking place. Tobago changed hands some 30 or 32 times. But there are only 3 battles in Tobago. There are 9 battles in Fort St. Joseph. Right? So there's more here than there is in Tobago. But it's just been totally and completely ignored. 300
all
years.
of the historians.
All of the historians.
I see.
I mean, and it goes on to the British capture of Trinidad. You wouldn't be here, I wouldn't be here, the East Indians wouldn't be here, the Chinese wouldn't be here, the Portuguese wouldn't be here if the British hadn't captured Trinidad in 1797.
Could you say then that that might be partly responsible for why we get this sense of from 1797 onwards? Because some people would even argue that before 1797, even though Trinidad was Spanish, you would find that Spain was not particularly interested, even when...
that is where we disagree on the book.
That's where we disagree.
That's where we disagree.
That's at least what the historians would say then.
Yeah.
That Spain was not particularly interested, but also that Port of Spain was... What was Port of Spain?
Capital by default.
Capital by default. St. Joseph was where the real action
the real
was.
capital should have been in Chaguaramas. That's where the Deepwater Harbor is.
All right. We could get to all of that. Let me come to the end of the book, Gaylord. We love to blame colonialism, but failing to correct what we perceive as propaganda is not the fault of colonialism, it is ours.
It is ours without a doubt. Without a doubt. What took place in Trinidad began this particular aspect of Trinidad history in this island, the germination of an idea that changed the entire South American continent and the whole of the Western Hemisphere took place here in this island. This was the home of this idea. This was the starting point, the logistic base. Right? And you can tell me about Alexander the Great. You can tell me about Napoleon. You can tell me about Caesar. And Caesar is written in Latin. Alexander is written in Greek. Napoleon in French. But you can't tell me about Bolivar, which is written in Spanish, because it's written in Spanish.
And there's Spanish all around us.
Exactly, Spanish all around us. Bolivar campaigned across 3,000 miles of mountainous country, including the Andes Mountains and the headwaters of the largest rivers on the earth, right, and conquered a country. And Marino, who came before him, started the whole South American, the building of modern South America. Right? But we know about Napoleon and all these people, but we don't know what happened here. We don't know what happened just across the water.
But let's talk about the history of the Spanish in Trinidad and Tobago in particular.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of what we have learned in school, and as you said, we disagree on the book, on some things that we have learned, and you say we have over the years we have gotten the colonial or the outside perspective. What I have learned in particular is that when, as Jared was saying recently, just now, when the Spanish inhabited Trinidad, Eric Williams usually referred to it as undeveloped. And in his book he called it the bankruptcy of Trinidad. It was during that period Trinidad was bankrupt because very little was done. And it's argued it's only when the British took over, and that's when Spanish laws remained, but the British took over, that Trinidad saw a bit of development. Now your book is saying that is not necessarily true. So tell me in your words what you understand and to counteract what is being taught in history.
I will quote Eric Williams for you. He writes off one of the greatest events of the 20th century, which is the First World War, with one paragraph about West Indian soldiers playing cricket alongside the Suez Canal. And yet still every year we go to the cenotaph and we lay wreaths for 185 dead men. That must have been some cricket match.
I wonder who won.
In other words, history was written for political purposes. And if it didn't suit the political purpose, it was simply left out.
What do you think is the political purpose why the Spanish impact on Trinidad was left out? Why do you think is not as prominent as it should?
It didn't serve the mood that he wanted to have developed in Trinidad towards the independence movement. Bringing up the Spanish side of Trinidad didn't serve that purpose. You see, so what served the purpose was sugar and slavery. Slavery didn't really get going in Trinidad until 1783, and it ended in 1834. That's one man's lifetime. Now that is not St. Kitts and Jamaica and Barbados. It's a totally different history. So the history of Trinidad is not the history of the other Caribbean islands. It's a totally different kettle of fish.
Is there something in it as well, Gaylord, that you're suggesting that in Eric Williams and similar writers, that you're looking then at sugar and the British and maybe that's the Spanish 300-year history before that? Not really.
It was not sugar.
Not sugar.
And when the British took Trinidad, they weren't in the least bit interested in sugar. They were interested in punishing Spain, right, for helping the American colonists in the American Civil War. And the Gulf of Paria is the most important, is the largest natural harbor in the Western Hemisphere.
There's a sense that all of these things has a lot of current implications.
Yes,
Kizzy and I, we've been looking at Dr. Chris Rampersad's review at the front of the book, and as well, we haven't had a chance to look at all of the book. But there's a sense of...
You need to.
Yes, there's a sense of current application. The president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, a lot in the news, running afoul of Washington, our own government here in Trinidad and Tobago, and some people say it's because of our oil, natural gas, and other connections to Washington why we are in a particular situation where Venezuela is concerned and how they are treating the rest of the Caribbean. But there's historical precedent for Venezuela's interest in the Caribbean. And if we're looking at the Spanish situation and people like Bolivar, the jump off point is there, Gaylord. How do you comment on that?
In 1970, I was based on Nelson Island during the mutiny in the regiment. And on the horizon, there was a Venezuelan destroyer and 2 attack transports with a battalion of Venezuelan Marines on board. And one of the Coast Guard ships had to ram the Venezuelan destroyer to stop it coming into Port of Spain Harbor. Right? In other words, Venezuela will not allow a radical regime to exist in Trinidad. Right? And much the same thing happened in 1990 with Abu Bakr. Right? Venezuela will not allow Trinidad to do its own thing. We may call ourselves independent all we want. We may talk about our boundaries and whatnot, but if Venezuela decides that they don't want us to go down a certain road, we're not going. As simple as that. Because military power is military power. I mean, there's a Venezuelan armored division based at Maturin. We don't even have a regiment. Right? A regiment is about 4 or 5 battalions. We don't even have that much. There's a whole armored division down in Maturin, right there. Right? So you have to be practical. You know, if
It takes
a
what,
radical
about
regime-
15 minutes to cross from there?
Exactly. If a radical regime takes charge of Trinidad, Trinidad is within the Venezuelan defense zone. There's a line that is marked on the charts showing what Venezuela will defend. And Trinidad's inside of that. Venezuelan school children are taught that there are 72 islands around Venezuela owned by Venezuela. Trinidad is one of those.
In the book,
Tobago is not, huh? Tobago is not. And just like the history of Tobago is so totally different to the history
Yes,
of
it
Trinidad.
is. It is.
Right? You just cross those 20 miles, you see different architecture, you see different ways of living, you see everything different. It's because the history of this country is completely different to the history of the rest of the Caribbean.
in this book in particular, Jared, you mentioned the point about pertinent issues that are relating to society now. And one of the lines that popped out at me is when you spoke about the insider's perspective in relation to that this book offers an appreciation of why the Caribbean occupies such an important position in the South American drug trade. And it popped out at me. Explain to me, put it into context when you
Because
talk about
what is said in the book is a question. Is Trinidad a Caribbean island or a South American island?
is it?
I think it's a South American island
Why?
because of the Spanish influence, right? And I explained that by asking you which other Caribbean island had a 1970, 1973 to 75, if you remember, enough guerrillas, 1990, and then in 1983 I asked whether the Soviet Union was interested in nutmegs in Grenada. And I don't think so. What they wanted was the gateway to South America, which was strongly anti-communist. Right? No other Caribbean island has a history of 4 challenges to democracy in 4 decades. That's Trinidad.
Which puts our history a lot closer to South
To South America than to the rest of the Caribbean. Completely wrong. Yeah.
Which is peculiar because, I mean, you look further up the Caribbean and you see a lot of French influence, and you think of things like the French Revolution, Martinique and so on, St. Lucia and so on, but yet still we don't see that kind of revolutionary fervor, is what you're saying, as compared to Trinidad.
And
it's
the Spanish influence. And the Spanish influence, you have to take it back to find out where does this South American influence come from. It comes from the conquistadors. The conquistadors were the knights of the Reconquista who conquered Spain from the Moors. And the Moors were the spiritual children of the horse people of the Russian steppe. Right? So the conquistador fighting in South America was facing the wrath of the horsemen of the steppes, the Huns, the Tartars and so at second hand. Right? The conquistador was factious. You couldn't trust him. He believed in double crossing people and all that sort of thing. And yet still he was a man of iron courage. You don't find those two mixed.
Going up against the might of Spain and that kind
That's
of
right.
thing.
You don't find those two mixed anywhere. You know, somebody who's willing to stoop to deceit and courage. Those two don't go together except in the conquistador and on the Russian steppes.
There's a program that we have here at Channel 4, we call it our Cross Country, Ralph Marage's program series that we run in the afternoons. One of them in particular highlights a lady by the name of Clara de Lima, and she talks about her sort of involvement with that Spanish revolutionary fervor, as it were, in relation to Venezuela. I see there's some reference to it in your book here.
Yes,
that in fact,
very
Trinidad is a sort of a base
very
to
strong.
protect and a hideaway.
Very, very, very strong base. We even have Venezuelan generals buried there. I mean, all the patriot leaders in Venezuela came here to rest. Rest, recuperate, buy more weapons, buy more uniforms, and whatnot. This was deliberate British policy. 1/3 of the army that fought the Battle of Carabobo that made Venezuela independent was British. They were British Napoleonic soldiers in their Napoleonic uniforms. You know, every South American leader had a British ADC alongside him so that he could talk to the English and Irish legions. Right? So it is much more than just sugar to Trinidad. This is strategy. It's world strategy. And then when it was all over, and all these various countries in South America were formed, they were allowed to form. And they were helped on their way towards forming, because one South America would have totally upset the balance of power in this part of the world. The United States would not have allowed or been very happy with South America as one country. Certainly France wouldn't, and Britain certainly wouldn't. Right? So the idea was, let them fight each other. Right? Now, Sucre said something that is very relevant to the modern world. He said, we South Americans have built our house on shifting sands. And historian after historian has tried to interpret that. The best interpretation that I have heard so far is that Sucre was saying that when a people are born and bred and live under autocratic rule, the rule of one man, be it a king, an emperor, or what, take them from that and push them straight into democracy, it doesn't work. South America became independent in 1826. The last country in South America to become democratic was 1996. It took an awful long time. Will Iraq become democratic?
Kelshall, you have tremendous application here by just that one statement.
He was saying that there needs to be some form of, interim type of government before you get to full democracy. That it doesn't work just from one to the other, And Iraq is a proof of that.
We're coming into our final minute here, Kizzy. A lot of food for thought.
But I'm thinking, now that you have produced this book, what are you going to do in terms of, you talk about rewriting history, but it needs to begin at the primary level, because definitely I know when you talk about South America, the University of the West Indies go in depth with these.
Yes, that's right, yes.
Definitely, because this aspect of history is taught in depth at the tertiary level. But I understand what you're saying when you say it's lacking at the primary and secondary level, because they focus on sugar.
Yes.
But probably the reason for that is because when people think of Trinidad, they really think of sugar.
Caribbean.
Well, of the Caribbean, they think of sugar, and that's because sugar and slavery has had a major impact on our society. And when you talk about immigration and stuff like that, that's probably your perspective. But
one lifetime. It's had a major impact on the rest of the Caribbean, yes. We're trying to hang on there. But we should be hanging on here.
So are you going to find a means to implement this? Because we need to get this into primary school. So what?
Well, it's a two-pronged assault training. On the 24th of July, we will be unveiling a bust of General Miranda in the museum in Chagama.
Gaylord, I'm going to have to ask you to hold it on that, and thank you very much, all right, for your time this morning. We've had a good look at this book and urge you to get a copy of it. Right about now, it's 7 o'clock and time for CMC's The Caribbean Today.